Good morning. Welcome to Staying Alive Session 6. And this morning, I'm going to talk about the issue of how a healthy diet cures the weight loss problem. Because everybody's had a weight loss issue sometime in their life. Most likely, it's a very popular concern. And it's a health concern, too. And there's a lot of myths surrounding the subject. And I'm not an expert on weight loss, but I've learned what I learned, and I've lived it. And so I'm going to tell you what I think and what I've learned. So first of all, let me say that the current fad of the high protein, low carb thing is very unhealthy and unnecessary. It does work for causing some weight loss, typically early in the game, simply because it ultimately results in a lower calorie consumption. But it comes at the cost of horrible food variety imbalance and even toxicity. Now, I did that program one time, ignorantly, several years ago, actually thinking I was treating my problem before I discovered what my problem was. And I lost weight. I lost 40 pounds in about 7 months. But it's not a sustainable thing. And I gained all that weight back plus more afterward. So we're going to talk about something different. We're going to talk about how the diet that I've been promoting really is a weight loss diet, naturally. So speaking of calorie reduction, you will lose weight if you reduce calorie intake below your daily needs. It's just simple math. But that is not the necessary or healthiest way to do it. You don't have to be concerned with that when you have a better method. Because the conventional wisdom is a calorie is a calorie. If you save a calorie, you benefit with some weight loss advantage. But that's not true. A calorie is not a calorie. There are a couple different types. Well, a calorie is a calorie, but the source makes a huge difference. Now, your body does have its natural optimal weight that it prefers to be. And if you eat a healthy diet, much like what we've been talking about, your body will naturally find that weight. And you won't be fat. So what I'm going to explain is how you can lose weight even while consuming more calories than your daily needs. You can lose weight without counting calories and while being on a high carbohydrate diet. Sounds kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it? And you can do it without increasing exercise, even though I recommend exercise for many reasons. I'm not knocking exercise at all. But as far as a weight loss mechanism is concerned, it can only take you so far as a practical matter. Now, all this that I just described happened to me. I lost 50 pounds, eating more calories, and not changing my exercise routine at all. In fact, during the shutdown period, when the gym was not open and I was not playing basketball for 2 years, I didn't gain a pound. So what I've done is not a temporary status, it's a permanent change. Now, there are a few key factors that make the biggest difference in weight loss, and I'm going to explain them. But first, we're going to identify all of the factors that have some bearing on the subject, and you're going to recognize all these, well, most of them. There are various factors that affect weight, and I'm going to present them in roughly order of relevance, and then explain the matter in more detail. So here we go. Weight loss factors. Can you see that?
Pretty much.
Okay. Last time the brightness was creating havoc on this video, so I made it a little darker. Now I've got this on paper. If you want to see it when I get to the end of it, you can go ahead and see it all. So the factors that are relevant to weight loss, I'm going to list 8 of them. 2 of them are the most relevant. So I'm going to notate them as such with an asterisk as the relevant ones. So first, Fat and oil in your diet. That's the big one. The thing about fat and oil is it's very calorically dense. A lot of calories in a very small volume. It's the most calorie dense food there is, by far. So it stands to reason that if you cut that, you will cut your total calories and you will lose weight. So it's got high caloric density, so that means if you cut it, you're going to lose weight. But there's another factor too, and the body prefers to store fat rather than burn it. So the more fat you eat, the more fat you store. We're going to talk about that in more detail as I get through this list. Okay, so there's another factor that's very relevant, and that is processed foods are a big factor in the weight loss equation, primarily because they contain a lot of fat and oil. And they're artificially high in caloric density because they have such low fiber. As we mentioned before, the bread with white flour has the fiber removed. So it's artificially calorically dense, and it's artificially high in sugar, oil, and salt, because they add those things to processed food. And those three things, sugar, oil, and salt, also increase cravings. The saltier your food is, the more you like it, and the more you want another bite, and another bite. And it tends to cause some overeating that would not otherwise happen. And then the overeating becomes a factor in the whole weight thing. Oil, also, we talked about, why do they add it? Well, it makes the food smoother, a little bit more pleasant. That also increases its appeal. And of course, sugar also increases its appeal. And so by increasing its appeal, you take more bites, plain and simple, beyond what you otherwise would. So that brings us to the other problem of overeating. You overeat because it's designed to make you overeat. Or you could overeat for other reasons, but as we all know, overeating is a factor. If you ate less, you'd lose. But you notice I don't have an asterisk, because if you cut the processed foods, you'll be much less likely to overeat. And if you do the rest of the regime that I'm talking about, you could overeat, and it would be okay. That's what I do. I eat a lot of food. I have no limit. I don't limit myself. I mean, I don't pig out on purpose, but if I want something, I have it. I don't worry about it. Of course, it'll increase all the factors, but again, there are reasons why it happens. If you stop the reasons, it doesn't happen as much, and it doesn't really matter much anyway, because it's not going to happen very much anyway on this new program. So what's another factor that affects weight loss? Obviously, exercise. Goes without saying, right? But if you want to lose weight through a lot of exercise, you're going to have to exercise a lot, because it takes a lot of exercise to burn a lot of calories to make a difference. So you burn about 100 calories a mile when you run. So it takes a lot of exercise to lose weight. Now, how many miles do you have to run every day to amount to a significant calorie reduction? If you want to cut 500 calories a day, are you going to run 5 miles a day every day, 7 days a week? Some people do, and they maintain their weight as a result. But if you don't run 5 miles a day, for example, your exercise routine probably will not affect your weight. And as I said, I play basketball on a regular basis, and there's some guys on the court that I've been playing with for years. We run hard, and nobody's weight ever changes. There's some big guys out there. My weight never changed for 5 years. At 230, 240, playing basketball. Then I changed my diet. All of a sudden I lost 50. Doing the same routine. So exercise is good, but if you're not a marathon runner, It's not really a factor in weight loss, unless you want to do a lot. I'm not knocking it. I like it. It's good for a lot of reasons, but it's a myth that you're going to lose weight with exercise unless you're seriously committed. What's another factor? Total calories a day. Obviously that matters on the one hand. Like I said before, if you go on one of these fad diets that ultimately results in a lower caloric intake than what you need, then you will lose weight. But that's sort of a shotgun approach. You're cutting calories by cutting everything, or some of the big offenders. But the easy way is just to cut the fattening kind of calories, which are these, the fat and oil, primarily. If you cut those calories, then you've done the work that gets the result, even if you don't cut other calories. And we're going to explain why that is. All right, what's another factor? And again, we're getting lower in the relevance level, more or less. Here's another factor that's low relevance: sugar and carbohydrates. Two ways of saying almost the same thing. Carbohydrates are complex sugars. Sugars come from they're the result of the breakdown of carbohydrates. If you cut them, you will lower your caloric intake, but again, you don't need to. Now, I recommend cutting sugar, because sugar is bad for you in a lot of different ways. But in terms of total carbohydrates, you could get by with a lot of them. In fact, you could be have a carbohydrate-based diet, which is what I have: potatoes, rice, other grains, oatmeal every day, and still lose weight, because it's not about the carbs. It's not about the carbs. I want to remind you, it's not about the carbs. Well, you know, I am big because I'm born that way. It's my family trait. Well, maybe there's a factor there. Or some other thing is going on in your nature that makes a difference. Certainly that is true to some degree, but it is typically not the biggest factor. It's rather low on the relevance level. It's a factor, but you could ignore that factor. With the right method, you'll get the results. Maybe a little tougher for some people, but the results still speak for themselves. Now, what's another factor? Psychological issues. I eat because I'm stressed. I eat because I'm anxious. I eat for comfort. Well, again, this may be true. However, what also may be true is, and what is more common, I think, from the sources I have consulted, that the psychological issues related to diet often come from being fat, don't necessarily cause it. Once you are in a condition that you're not happy with, that can lead to the psychological issues that manifest in overeating and contribute to the problem. But either way, if you employ the method, your psychological issues might not even have to change for you to lose weight. So these are the factors that I can account for in general, but the ones that are the most significant are the fat and oil and everything else that the supermarket wants us to buy. If you cut those, everything changes. Everything changes. And why is that? Well, it's because there are several dynamics that control the outcome. And there are three of them I'm going to mention. These are the big ones, maybe the only ones. Number one is satiety. Are you satiated when you eat? You start out hungry, you eat, you're satisfied, and you're not hungry anymore. The less hungry you are, the less you eat, right? You stop eating when you're not hungry anymore. So the satiety level drops. You have hunger, it gets replaced by satiety. You're satiated as you eat. Well, there's a mechanism in your body that controls the level of satiety and hunger balance. And if that balance is out of whack, you'll eat more than you otherwise would. So if you do what you have to do to bring it into balance, into its normal functioning mechanism, you'll eat less. And you'll be eating the right foods. So satiety is an important thing. We're going to talk about that. The other thing is caloric density. As I said before, fat and oil are the highest in caloric density, more calories per pound than anything. And if you have a high proportion of high caloric density foods, you're going to intake more calories. You've got more room for them in your stomach. So you're going to eat more food, and you're going to eat more calories, and you're going to gain more weight. So we care about the caloric density of our food and all the things that change or that make the difference between what is a calorically dense food and what is not. Then the third factor that's relevant is, as I mentioned briefly, when you eat fat or oil, fat, the body prefers to store fat rather than burn it. It is low on the priority list for what to be burned. Carbs are high, fats are low. So your body would rather store the fat than burn it. So that's a factor that makes a big difference in the ultimate result. Now, your stomach has been designed by God to function with a brilliantly designed management system. You hear people talk about how evolution designed this to be such and such based on factors that happened back in ancient days. If you just take the word evolution and you put God in there, it makes perfect sense that there's a design behind it for a good reason. So God has designed your body, He's designed your stomach to detect the volume and the type of food that you just ate, and to then react with a regulated degree of hunger and satiety accordingly. Now, if you have an imbalance in this hunger and satiety balance, you will eat too many calories, you'll store too much fat, and a little bit of that every day adds up over time. Let's just take a simple analogy. If the only factor was matching your caloric intake to your caloric use, if you need 2,000 calories a day to do what you do, and you eat 2,000 calories a day, your weight will stay the same. If you eat less than 2,000 calories a day, your weight will go down, right? You'll burn something off. If you eat more than 2,000 calories a day, your weight will go up, right? Now, how do you keep that balance? Do you always eat every day the amount of calories you need for that day? It's always going to fluctuate, isn't it? And every time you're too high on the calories, in my analogy, you're going to put on a few ounces of weight or whatever the quantity is. It doesn't have to be a lot, because a tiny bit a day adds up over time. Day by day, month by month, year by year. If you gain 10 pounds a year, in 5 years, that's 50 pounds. If you gain 1 pound a year, in 25 years, that's 25 pounds. So this balance is very critical. And keeping a right balance is difficult to do if you're going to rely on the calorie counting and the old-fashioned methods we've been talking about. But if you don't, you'll gain weight. That's why people typically gain weight over time. You look back at your old photos and you're skinny, right? Here we are in our later years and we're bigger. There's a lot of factors that play into that, but one of the factors is this problem of maintaining the caloric balance. So that is a tightrope you got to walk if you're going to use that calorie counting method, and you're going to lose that battle because you cannot control it enough. You can't control it accurately enough. But yet your stomach has this built-in ability to help you balance if you don't goof it up. So here's what the stomach senses. There's two factors in the formula, the volume and the type of food. The first factor, the volume, the stomach has stretch receptors. As you add food to your stomach, it's going to have to stretch to accommodate, right? Well, as it stretches, it sends a signal to the brain, I'm stretching, there's more food here. So the stretching signal reduces the hunger reflex and increases the satiety feeling. You feel more satisfied as your stomach enlarges with more food in it. That's a natural process. I mean, when you're hungry, you don't tell yourself you're hungry. You just feel it. It's automatic, right? When your stomach is small because there's very little in it or nothing in it, you'll be hungry. You know how it feels. And you know how it feels when the hunger goes away, when you fill your stomach with food. That's because you have stretch receptors in your stomach that tell your brain how to react, how to feel. Do I feel hungry? Do I feel satiated? That balance changes as the stretch receptors detect the stretch. Pretty simple concept. This helps the balance function normally. That is a factor in regulating that balance between hunger and satiety. The second factor is the type of food. Now, believe it or not, your stomach can tell the difference in the different types of food that you eat. It has receptors that detect fiber and protein and fat. And the more of these three things that it senses, the more it will decrease the hunger reflex and increase the satiety feeling. So as you eat these things, not only the size and the volume of your stomach makes a difference, but also the volume of these factors, the magnitude of these factors. The body knows that fat is more calorically dense. And it will give you a greater sense of satiety when you eat fat so that you won't overeat it. It will give you less of a sense of satiety with fiber because the body knows those are not calorically dense foods. Now the two factors, the stretch receptors and the food type receptors, they're operating on different principles. And they're going to send conflicting signals depending on what you eat in some cases, right? But it's the balance of those conflicting signals that affects the ultimate balance between the hunger and the satiety. So they work together to produce an ultimate result. And they are tuned by design to work together so that the ultimate balance is the right balance. The ultimate resulting mechanism is the right mechanism. But these mechanisms are designed to operate in an environment where you're eating a healthy diet. And you're not changing the rules of the game in the process. Because if you are eating a normal healthy diet, you're not going to be eating a lot of fat and oil as an additive to your food. You're not going to add, if you don't add oil to your salad, and the only oil you eat is what's latently in your food, in your olives, in your beans, in your whatever, to whatever degree they exist there, that's the proportions which your stomach is designed to expect. But if you add oil, your body's not going to detect that for what it is because it's not designed to recognize that as a food. So it's going to only recognize it as an oil to some limited degree. It's not going to recognize it for what it really is because it's designed to recognize whole foods. When your body recognizes a fiber type food, it says, I know what the caloric density of that is, and I'm going to react accordingly. When you eat an avocado and the body knows what the caloric density of that is, it reacts accordingly. But when you add oil, the body says, I don't really know what that is. I'm going to give it my best guess, and you're going to throw the balance off. So the caloric density of whole foods is easily recognized by the body. But when you change the caloric density by using processed foods, now you have mixed up the signals that your body can understand and recognize and react to. And so you're not going to be as satisfied with those foods as you would with the alternative foods. And so the result is you're going to eat more of those foods. It's plain and simple. You're going to eat more of them. And of course, the caloric density, high caloric density foods are by nature going to add more calories to your diet. So the added fat and oil concentrates nutrition and calories without the bulk necessary to fill you up. And of course, defibered foods are high in fat and sugar. So Let me show you another slide that highlights the concept of the relevance of high caloric density foods and the relevance of the zero-sum game that is your stomach, because you only have a certain amount of space. And if you fill it up with high caloric density foods, then you're going to fill it with less regular density foods. So here's an example of 400 calories of oil. Doesn't take up much space at all. Now your body would rather see this kind of 400 calories of food. It recognizes this amount of food as 400 calories. It's not going to recognize this amount of food as 400 calories. It's going to think it's a lot less. It's going to keep you hungry. For two reasons: because of the size, your stomach is not full yet, and because of the type. And here in the middle, 400 calories of chicken is not very much volume. It doesn't take much to get a lot of calories and leave a lot of room for more calories. But if you fill your stomach up with lower caloric density foods, natural whole foods, vegetable priorities, then you're going to reach satiation a lot sooner in the eating process. Now, I'm going to show you another slide, and you can go ahead and take the handout on this one. It's on the far right there. This one is going to be comparing the caloric density of common foods. Can you reach that? And as you can see, the highest caloric density food of all is oil. 4,000 calories per pound. Now, nobody's going to eat a pound of oil at one time. But for comparison purposes, it's got the highest caloric density, 4,000 calories per pound. Let's go straight to the bottom. Vegetables, non-starchy vegetables, 150 calories per pound. There's a huge disparity and a huge range of caloric density across the spectrum of various foods. And you'll notice that as you start from the bottom and you work up, you don't get very far before you stop and hit the, what I call the more problematic foods. The meat and the processed foods. This one, the bread, it's high caloric density because it's white flour, typically. But up you go on the scale, you get into more processed foods and more oily foods. So let's look at them in detail. The second one down, chocolate. 3,000 calories per pound. The thing about chocolate is it's mostly fat and sugar, period. It's just fat and sugar. The chocolate itself is a very small proportion of its total volume. But chocolate is bitter, so you got to have sugar to make it palatable, and you got to have the fat to make it the substance that it is. Now, I like chocolate. And I keep saying I don't really miss the things that I don't eat anymore, but I kind of miss a few things. One of them is chocolate. So well, here's what I do. I make chocolate milk. I make it out of oat milk. I mix a little cocoa powder with it, and I put a little stevia, various other natural, high-potency, low-calorie sweeteners, and that's chocolate milk. Sometimes I add fruit puree to it to make it a little more interesting, but it tastes just like chocolate milk. And it's nice and creamy, and it takes care of my need for chocolate. So chocolate's a high calorie density food. What else? Nuts and seeds and the butters, peanut butter and so forth. Because naturally, nuts are high in oil. So they're otherwise healthy, so you can get by with a little bit of it, but realize that, more than a handful at a time, that's a lot of oil. And so it's gonna throw off your balance if you have a lot of it. Okay, what else? The obvious offenders: cakes, donuts, and pastries, 2,700 calories per pound. It's got fat, it's got sugar, it's got a lot of missing fiber, and it's high in caloric density. Now, chips, potato chips. Potatoes are good. You can eat potatoes all day long, but you fry them in oil, now you've got an oil product, basically. And everything out there that's fried in oil is going to have oil in it. It's going to just zoom up that caloric density and increase the proportion of oil overall. And it's going to throw off your body's ability to sense what it really is. Very high in caloric density. What's next? Sugar. Sugar is 1,800 calories per pound. And I put Coke on there because Coke is identical to sugar. You would think, well, wait a minute, there's water in the Coke. That's going to reduce the caloric density. True, for a few minutes. But that water is going to seep out of through your intestine, your stomach wall, and you're going to be left with nothing but the sugar in a few minutes. So Coke and sugar have the same ultimate caloric density. 1,800 calories per pound. That's a lot. And I mean by Coke, any kind of sugary soft drink. It's got a lot of calories. It's just nothing but calories. Then, of course, there's the bread and the pastries right in the middle of the scale. And this is white bread. If you compare that to whole grain bread, it's much different in caloric density, about 500, because you've got the fiber there to take up more space. So the typical bread you find on the shelf is really no different than, a croissant or something else, some kind of pastry. It's a lot of caloric density. And what about ice cream and cheese, the dairy products? And the meat and dairy, they're of course high in caloric density. The thing about cheese is, and ice cream, they have sugar and fat. Milk has a lot of sugar. It doesn't taste sweet, but it has lactose, which is a complex sugar. People say, oh, I'm lactose intolerant, I can't have milk. But I can have lactose-free milk. Well, what is lactose-free milk? Well, they don't take the sugar out. They add lactase, which is an enzyme that breaks down the lactose into simple sugars. So the sugar is still there. It's now a simple sugar rather than a complex sugar. And you can digest it because it's a simple sugar, not a lactose. And you don't necessarily have enough lactase to digest it, so that step has been taken care of for you. And if you drink lactose-free milk, you will notice it's very sweet compared to regular milk, because you're now tasting the sugar that you otherwise wouldn't taste. But the sugar's still there, no matter what form it's in. So when you take something like ice cream, what is it? They add sugar to sugar. It's got the sugar of lactose, and then they add more sugar to make it taste sweet. So ice cream is a sugar bomb on top of the fat that's in the milk and the cream. So ice cream is a highly caloric dense food. Of course, meat and dairy is high in caloric density because of its fat content. Now here we get into the vegetable category. Avocado. It's a rather high fat food by nature. That's why it's so creamy and so yummy. But it is what it is. So I've taken them out of my diet because I'm avoiding fat. If you have them in your diet, you just kind of watch and make sure you don't have a ton of it. Beans and legumes are very low in caloric density. Whole grains are low. Potato, corn, and squash. The things that we think of as high-calorie foods are really, in terms of the density of calories in that food and the volume of space they take up in your stomach and the acceleration they bring in the balance of reducing the hunger and increasing the satiety, they're very functional in that regard, and so they end up being not so calorically worrisome after all. Same goes for oats and even fruit, which is very sweet. If you eat the whole fruit with its fiber, that fiber content reduces the caloric density. It also slows down the digestion and absorption of the sugar that's in it. It becomes a very healthy food, and your body expects fruit to be consumed in its whole form, and that's why I eat almost zero fruit juice. It's concentrated sugar. I'll eat fruit puree because it's whole food, but I try to avoid fruit juice because of its high caloric density. And then of course vegetables, you can eat them all day long, very few calories, very high volume, very significant ratio there of low caloric density. So the stomach has a hard time sensing high caloric density foods that are processed foods. Whole foods, the body's very good at detecting their nature. But processed foods, the body's not expecting them. It's not ready for that. It doesn't understand them, and it gives false signals. And so you eat more because you stay hungry and not as satisfied. Now, there are individual differences between people in terms of this mechanism of how their stomach detects the nature of food. And a lot of skinny people think, oh, you know, I've got the advantage of a high metabolism where I can eat whatever I want, and that's an advantage for me. When in fact, that's not normal. That's probably a defect in the stomach's ability to sense food. These people are probably experiencing an imbalance where their hunger reflex is too low, their satiety reflex is too high, and as a result, they eat less. And as a result, they don't gain weight. And they think, oh, I can eat like a horse. But in reality, if you actually measured the volume of their food, they're probably eating less because their stomach is not responding as accurately as it should because they have a defect in their nature. They're not better off because of this situation. They're actually experiencing a defect, and the side effect is they eat less, so they weigh less, but they're still not getting the benefit of the right diet. So they're going to eat just as much. They're going to eat just as much. They're going to eat too much fat and oil that they should, even though ultimately it's not going to make a huge difference in their end result. And that's why you see some very skinny people have heart disease and strokes, and you think, well, how can that happen to them? They don't have an obesity problem or anything like that, but yet they have heart disease rates just like everybody else, because they're just lucky that they have a defect that causes them to eat less. So they maintain a low weight, but they're still eating unhealthy. Your weight is not necessarily a direct measure of your low weight. It's not necessarily a direct measure of healthiness. Your high weight is typically a direct measure of your unhealthiness, but your low weight is not automatically a measure of your healthiness. It's all about the fat and oil and the whole foods. That's the measure of healthiness. And if you do that, you will lose weight, because you'll be eating lower caloric density foods, so a lower caloric intake overall. You'll be eating less fat and oil, which has other benefits that I'm going to explain next. And your hunger versus satiety proportional functionality will work more accurately to control your total intake. So, as you think about changing your diet, as we've been talking about, here's what you're ultimately doing. You're not really cutting things, you're just swapping things. Swapping things that don't belong for things that do belong. If you think of it in that way, it makes it easier. It's a dietary content problem, not volume problem. There's nothing wrong with you physically or psychologically if you're overweight, necessarily. It's just these mechanisms are doing what they're supposed to do. And we are being led along by the momentum of our culture to eat what's on the shelf, because if it's there, it must be okay, right? They're selling it, it must be past some kind of test somewhere. But in fact, it's all just crazy nonsense. And it's not in sync with what your body's supposed to do. So, if you're going to make a change, if it seems like a lot of effort to do it, well, you can just start slow. Maybe change one meal a day first, like breakfast. See how that goes, and then work up from there. Now, the only way to have the perfect balance of calories needed to calories burned and the right amount of food is to have food in their normal whole food proportions. Then your stomach's normal function will regulate your intake. You try to avoid the processed and concentrated foods. Go with high fiber, low fat, low sugar foods. Now, I've talked a lot about how fat and oil are calorically dense. Okay, that's factor number one. Well, factor number two is the body prefers to store fat rather than burn it. Now, here's what that's all about. First, we got to understand how the body processes energy. The body uses your intake of nutrients to ultimately manufacture a molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is the molecule that your cells use for energy on a moment-by-moment basis. That's what they burn for energy. So your food is going to supply your body with the ingredients it needs to make ATP. And you can make ATP in a variety of ways. You can feed that process through carbs, which break down into sugar, namely glucose. So glucose is the primary way the body manufactures ATP for energy. It's the primary fuel for that. An alternative fuel is fat. And a third alternative fuel is protein. Those three things, glucose, fat, and protein, are the fuels your body can utilize to make ATP for energy. Now, of the three, glucose is the preferred method. It's the preferred fuel. It's the first resort that the body uses to make energy. It is the simplest and the quickest way, and it yields it uses a sufficient amount of energy for its volume. So glucose as fuel for making energy is the preferred method, and as long as glucose is available to your body, it will use that as its first line of utility. And glucose exists in your body in two forms. Just free-flowing glucose in the bloodstream, and the body stores glucose in a form called glycogen. It's a little more complex version of it, and that's stored in your liver and in your muscle cells. And when your body needs more glucose than what your blood sugar can supply, it'll go to the glycogen, break it down quickly, turn it into glucose, and then use that. So glucose, whether in its raw form or as a form of glycogen, is your first line of usability for energy. It's the first line fuel. And in fact, as you know, the ability of your body to use glucose relies on the production of insulin to open up the cells to receive glucose from the bloodstream. The mere presence of insulin in the bloodstream inhibits fat utilization for energy. So while you're burning glucose, insulin levels are going to be elevated. That's going to create the priority usage of glucose over fat in the energy production business. And even if the glucose stores are used up, the insulin levels are going to remain a little bit high for a little while until they drop gradually. And in that process, you're not going to be burning glucose, and you're not going to be burning fat because there's no more glucose left, and the insulin is preventing fat usage, so you're burning nothing. Some people have a severe reaction to that called hypoglycemia, but in the meantime, the body can use protein to supplement as an alternative. It can break it down into glucose and then use it in that immediately right there. So that's just a normal part of the stopgap mechanism that helps you get by when you have to, transition from one activity to the other. So conceptually now, if you want to burn stored fat, you're going to have to, by the conventional wisdom, you're going to have to cut the glucose to convert the attention of your body now to burning fat. But the better alternative is to not store the fat in the first place. And that's the thing you can control. Now, in terms of the usage of glucose, it takes about 30 minutes of exercise to burn up the available stores of glucose. Now, as you digest food, there's a constant supply of it coming, but as you exercise, you're using glucose faster than you can absorb it, and you'll run out. And it takes about 30 minutes of exercise to run out of glucose or glycogen, or you can fast. You'll run out eventually, certainly within a day. And in fact, at night, you tend to run low on glucose as you sleep, because you're burning glucose without replenishing it. And so your best fat burning hours are at night while you sleep. So your body has to run low enough on glucose before it'll start to resort to burning fat. Now, by comparison, glucose yields per glucose molecule. I said before that the purpose of this fuel is to create ATP for energy. About 1 molecule of glucose will yield about 32 molecules of ATP for your body's usage. By contrast, one molecule of fat will yield about 100 molecules of ATPs, very calorically dense. So if your energy needs exceed the rate or volume available from glucose, such as through vigorous exercise or going a long stretch without food, the body turns to its second line of fuel, which is fat. Now let's talk about fat. The body stores fat from your dietary intake of fat. We tend to think that if I eat a lot of sugar or carbs that turn into sugar, more than I need for those, those excess calories, the body will turn that sugar into fat. It is true that the body can turn sugar into fat, but it doesn't happen very often. The body doesn't prefer to do it. It's a highly energy inefficient process, and the body avoids doing that. So the idea that if you cut sugar, it won't turn into fat is really a myth. Sugar does not turn into fat. The reason why you lose weight when you cut sugar is because you lower your overall caloric intake. And if you lower it enough so that you run out of glucose often enough to get your body to resort to using fat, then you'll start to use up fat. But you're not losing weight because you have interfered with the sugar into fat mechanism, because there really isn't a sugar into fat mechanism in play. So the key to losing fat is to stop the intake. And every time your body runs a little bit low on glucose and starts to use a little bit of fat, that takes you one step closer to losing a little bit more. And if that happens often enough over time, typically at night while you sleep, you'll lose the fat. And you can do that without worrying about the carbs. Because if you have excess calories from carbs, they will not turn into fat. The body will not convert sugar to fat. Your body will burn off carbs, excess carbs, as body heat, just to get rid of it. If you have more sugar than you need, it will not turn to fat, it'll just become a heat, and it'll burn off. The body would rather burn off the carbs as body heat rather than convert them to fat. So really, the only fat you store, as a practical matter, is sourced from the fat you eat. So if you don't worry about counting calories, and you don't worry about limiting carbs, although you should limit sugar for other reasons, you eat complex carbohydrates, which are better for you, and a little sugar here and there won't kill you. But if instead of worrying about the sugar and the carbs intake, and the calorie counting, or even the quantity of food, if you just cut the fat, you will cut this process off at the knees, and you will lose weight. Now, it has been said, the fat you eat is the fat you wear. Goes straight from your lips to your hips. If you remember that, that's a good rule of thumb. Remember I said in that list of factors that are most relevant, top of the list is fat and oil. Second on the list is processed foods, because they are high in fat, typically. That's the reason why they're such culprits. So if you cut the fat, you will lose weight, no matter how much other things you eat. You can lose weight by cutting caloric density, but that's the hard way. Now, you will cut the caloric density by eating whole foods that have less fat. You will be killing two birds with one stone. But if all you do is to worry about cutting the caloric density, that's going to be the hard way of doing it. You can lose weight by exercising a lot. I remember one time I worked in a factory, and I was going back and forth from the tool shed to the factory floor many times a day. And I actually figured out, this is before the days when you could measure your steps and all that stuff very easily, but I just calculated how much mileage I did every day. It was about 5 miles of walking every day. And I was losing weight. I lost about 10 pounds during about 6 months of that, just because of exercise. So you can lose weight by exercise. Seriously, you're going to cut down your caloric ultimate balance. So yeah, it'll matter. But you have to exercise a lot for it to make a huge difference. Again, I say exercise is good for so many good reasons, including weight loss. But So it's a low priority factor in the overall formula. The biggest factor by far is cutting the fat. Now here's what I did. I switched to this diet for therapeutic reasons. I didn't know any of this. I cut the fat and oil and the process. Well, I cut the animal products and the processed food. And I increased the vegetable content and fruit and so forth, and grains. For therapeutic reasons because of cancer. And for health in general, of course. I immediately started losing weight. I lost 40 within the first year, without even trying. Was never hungry, had enough food to eat as much as I wanted. Then I learned about the value of cutting the fat. I was already cutting fat because I wasn't eating animal products. I was already cutting fat because I wasn't eating processed foods, but I was eating a lot of nuts. And I was still frying French fries in coconut oil. And I was still eating avocados like crazy. And olives like crazy. So I didn't realize the benefits of cutting the fat. I was just sticking with the natural side of the fat issue. Well, then I realized all this. I began to learn it. And so I just cut the fat altogether. Bingo, lost another 10, 15 right off the bat. And now I've reached, I think, what is probably my optimal weight. And again, I've mentioned this before. This is my teenage weight. I am the same weight today as I was when I was 19. I think my muscle mass proportion is different. Because I could do a lot of things then I can't do now. But I feel the same. And so the point is that I eat all the carbs I want. I don't eat sugar, of course. And I eat a lot more food than I ever did. And I don't count calories. And I don't care about volume. And I don't gain weight. And it's been 3.5 years. It's not a temporary fix. It's a permanent lifestyle change and a permanent physical change. So eat all the carbs you want. The low carb thing is a myth. As long as you cut the fat. That's the issue. All right. I think we're almost done. Anybody have any questions? Okay. Well then, I will see you next time. Thank you.